Oliver. Okay, this is our answer. Good evening, everyone. That gives me the cue, as we are recording now, to open up officially our session tonight. I'm afraid your usual host, Professor Burns, Tony Burns, my colleague, is unavailable this evening. So it's my pleasure to chair this final installment of Andy Higginbottom's series of lectures on Capital Volume 1. It has been really a fascinating tour de force, bringing us to a glorious finale, with no doubts, this evening, but perhaps also provides us with a great outlook, because there are already plans in place for a similar series on Capital Volume 2. Yeah, again, with a reading group linked into that. And so we've just discussed it. It's a fantastic resource, which we're also going to have, of course, on our CSSGJ website to be consulted whenever necessary. So it has really come together well. Our thanks to Andy, and we do it in the usual manner. Andy, you have the first 40, 45, perhaps 50 minutes for your lecture. And we then afterwards still have another 30 minutes or so for questions and discussions. Just before I hand over to Andy, if we could all make sure that our microphones are always switched off, so that there are no background noises while Andy is presenting. Okay, thanks a lot, everyone. Andy, over to you.
Andreas, thank you very much, and in particular Oliver and Tony as well, the team. I mean, I do appreciate very much the platform that you've given me and the sort of infrastructure that it allows us to do this series, and we'll come back to that at the end of today's lecture as well. So this is what I'm going to cover. I mean, our focus is on Marx's methodology, and I won't read this one all out, but you can see the different points there that I want to cover. I'm going to say a little bit about, repeat my take on all of this, and then I'm going to argue what I think is the basic thesis that Marx had to address and succeeded in achieving, demonstrating his basic argument. And then we'll look at how he went about doing that, and maybe some comments at the end. Now, of course, many of us are or have been academics, and we will know what academic work looks like and the type of standards which are required to publish academic work. And of course, the first thing is we need to engage with existing literature. And this is a matter of surveying what that literature is, but also positioning oneself in relation to that literature and sort of evaluating it. A second major strand, of course, is knowing the relevant empirical material. And the third strand is the theoretical development. Now, normally in academic work, especially if it's a PhD, but also more generally, what's required is a statement of how this all works together in the work that's produced, and a methodology which sort of positions the work in terms of how the work was carried out. And that's also not only to declare a position, but also to argue that in a way the work can be repeated or developed in some way. And the two main strands there, and many candidates find this difficult to state, is normally the hardest and last thing that in my experience students do, is to state their ontology, which is to actually state what assumptions they make of the character of the reality which they've been studying, and their epistemology, which is how they go about learning and studying that reality. Now, in my assessment, Marx was excellent on the first three things. He has very strong critical engagement, very good on the empirical material, massive conceptual development. But he didn't tell us very much, really, about his methodology. There are a number of key points which he's left us, which we'll sort of go on to. The first is he was very clear about the difference between the method of investigation, how one learns about a subject area, and the form of presentation or exposition. And he was very conscious about this. And of course, one is to do with cognition. And he generally, and this goes certainly in the Grundrisse introduction, he writes about this, the movement from the concrete to the abstract, which, if you like, the first cut view is from the empirical to the theoretical. But then in terms of the exposition rather than the research side, he tends to see this as a movement from the abstract to the concrete. Now, Marx himself, in the methodology which he developed, and he developed it through a constant process of rewriting, rethinking, reworking. I think the volume 1 of Capital, as it was first published in 1867, was probably about the 5th or 6th draft of that book. So he combined very much in practice the phase of cognition and exposition while maintaining, if you like, analytically the distinction. In terms of Capital, there is a so-called 4th volume, which is, if you like, the literature review. Marx's engagement with political economists before him, but that comes into Capital quite a lot as well as the separate literature review. Now, that's the question about methodology. There's also the question of an introduction. And again, this is fairly standard social science academic stuff. An introduction would include a statement of what the problem areas being looked at, might just outline, rather than going into any detail about the existing literature, outline the main approaches, what's being argued in this work, and how the argument proceeds. Well, Marx, actually, I say Marx does not do this. Actually, I think he does do that a little bit, I have to say, having, I should have updated this thing. The preface to volume 1 gives us a bit of this, right? But I would say, by contrast, that he signposts extremely well at chapter level. He's always linking, summarizing well, and also at paragraph level very often. So we often know where you anticipate, it's easy for the reader to anticipate where the argument goes. And this is a very strong characteristic of Marx's writing. And when we read it, we can feel the movement in the writing. But it is true that Capital, given the importance and size and significance of the work overall, could certainly do with a fuller introduction and a fuller statement of its methodology. I want to say very quickly, because I think if you're following this, you know this already, my own project, Distinct from Marx, is very much currently a sort of a response to Marini's work, and the publication of his analysis is a sort of a major step forward in that. But I'm also particularly interested in the theory of rent because of extractivism in Latin America. And my assessment is, positioning myself against the literature, I think Marini solved quite a few of the big problems in terms of superexploitation and capital. Not all of them, but he was very knowledgeable. You can tell that in his work, and he did solve a lot of the problems. Not so much the question of rent, I think, and extractivism, but many of the others. Now, when we look at, if we want to develop from Marx, one of the questions is, okay, so at what point, one of the questions I ask myself, let's put it like that, is, okay, so what level do we go in at? I mean, is the whole thing to be thrown aside? Is everything literally correct? Or if it's somewhere in between, where is that in between? At what points do we start developing from this existing building? Where do we start putting our extensions on it? It's a bit mechanical, but I hope you get the idea. And in order to answer that question, we then take a step back into what is Marx's method and how is it expressed. If we want to build on Marx, then of course we need to attune ourselves to his method. And there's a massive literature on this. I mean, believe me, it takes a lot of study to look through literature. Not all of it, but most of it tends to be linked with Marx's relationship with Hegel, because Marx's methodology is generally accepted to be one of a form of dialectics which he developed from, and if you like, also a rupture from Hegel. Now, just in terms of my own work, I'm happy with some of the results, but there's quite a lot more to do, especially in the area of unequal exchange, and that's where my work is headed, actually, relation transformation problem, unequal exchange. And again, there's a very strong existing literature which I'm very happy to sort of engage with, because I think, again, a lot of the problems have actually been solved. They just haven't been clearly brought out. So that's where I'm coming from. Now let's go back to what was the problem Marx was addressing, right? Marx entered into the fray of political economy, having departed really the fray of critical philosophy. And what he found was that classical political economy was in a state of dissolution. And Ricardo, who had been the major figure, left a legacy which left it unclear, a very sort of basic point, which is what is the basic determinant or regulator of commodity prices. And on the one hand, you can take Ricardo's legacy as being based on profit. That is, that all capitals will have will be awarded similar rates of profit, and on that basis, that's one basis of deciding commodity prices. But of course, is that the same as commodity prices are essentially based on the labor time which is embodied in them? And that those two methods of determining commodity prices come up with quite different answers. And the result in Ricardo, he wasn't fully aware of it, but the result was an inconsistency. Now, Marx doesn't deny this inconsistency. It's quite important. For Marx, this inconsistency isn't really an inconsistency as such. It's the expression of a real contradiction in the capitalist mode of production. And that contradiction is that the commodity is the product of labor, but it is also the vehicle for the valorization of capital. And in a different sense, if you like, it's the product of capital. So this is a contradiction. It's based on the class contradiction. Now, the way Marx goes about going beyond Ricardo is his system of dialectical logic is one of a combination of inner connection, planes of abstraction, mediations, and in particular, in my view, the question of the inversion in the capitalist mode of production of essence and appearance. And the prime example of that, which speaks to the problem we had to solve, is that surplus labor, which comes from the working class, appears as profit. And that's not just a quantitative issue, it's a qualitative issue, because what it means is when Marx looked at the combination of capitalist production and circulation, the product of capital, commodity appears as though it's the product of capital and not the product of labor. That's the degree of the inversion. So capital claims the effective output of labor as its own product, its own special product, which is profit. Okay, so this form determination, as it's called, because you've got a socially objective economic form, but the form determination of profit and the commodity form, which is carrier of profit, hides capitalist exploitation. Okay, now Marx's analysis doesn't end there, right? He's also in volume 3 looking at the profit form and the rate of profit. And he has a further turn of the cycle in terms of what form determination means. And what he's got is a necessity of the mode of production as a totality going into crises of profitability. And finally, the political implication of this, which Lenin drew out and others, rather than Marx himself, is, well, Marx gives us many pointers, I have to say, many statements, especially, for example, to the end of volume 1, that the continuation of capitalism is going always to mean increased suffering or continued suffering of the working class. And in the end, the only way this can be overcome is by overthrowing the capitalist mode of production. So I think all of that, I mean, this is a summary of the main arc of Marx's argument. The way the literature was left with Ricardo, I mean, the Ricardo's followers split into two camps, basically. Some agreed with the profit-based explanation and some agreed more with the labor-based explanation. But the way they debated it was more quantitative. But what I'm trying to show is this is the first way this issue came up was quantitative, but what determines price. But actually, it's a fundamentally qualitative issue, right? Which is who produces new value. And if you look at corporations today, they're always boasting they're producing new value for their shareholders, aren't we wonderful, and so on. And of course, this is commonplace. This is the normal running of the capitalist mode of production, which is to hide the source of new value, which is the appropriated labor of the working class. So I'm going to explain this a slightly different way, but from this diagram, this is one of the 2 or 3 sort of major diagrams I hope that you'll sort of take away and think about, right? In the work of Adam Smith, that he had a theory of value, right? But he didn't think it worked for capitalism. So as long as there is small production, then it works. Okay. Now, Ricardo does take this further, and he sees that value pertains in the capitalist mode. Well, he didn't call it capitalist mode of production, but in the effectively capitalist mode of production. And he had a concept of profit, but he couldn't really make a clear connection between the two. So Marx was the first one to do this, and his connection is the concept of surplus value. It's not the only connection, but it is. This is the internal relation, right? Between the theory of value and capitalist profit. And the bearer of value and surplus value, and indeed profit, is the commodity. So there's 2 important points here. The first is Marx uses the idea of internal relations to draw out the real internal class relation in production between capital and labor, which is the production of surplus value. So there's a methodological connection between his method and his content, right? He's delving into the social relations of production and not leaving it on the surface. So it's a sort of from the surface to the interior, to use spatial metaphor. The second issue is that the commodity develops in Marx from the bearer of value, its initial and, if you like, most simple form, to the bearer of surplus value, and finally to the bearer of profit. Now, this is the absolute guts of, I mean, he got to this point by 1857, right? But he fills it in. He's incredibly conscientious about filling in these mediations, as he called them. So he looks at the form of value, and he explains money. And so his 2 main advances on Ricardo are not only that value, the substance of value is labor, but the form of value as exchange value, he also explains, which is in chapter 1. And then the second big advance is the concept of surplus value. There's a third big advance, which we don't get to till volume 3, which is this concept of prices of production. So I'm just putting in with this bit how there's an evolution in Marx's own sort of theoretical journey in terms of filling in these gaps, and you can see it over certainly a 10-year period, and then stretching on after the publication of volume 1 as well. Now, these are the main steps, which he starts off with value and ends up with profit. Now, what happens here, by the way, is that this is moving further and further away from labor, right? But because Marx makes all the connections, then actually through these mediations, we can see that there is a basis for profit in surplus labor, surplus value. In the connection, he makes the connections basically. So they don't appear as separate phenomenon. They appear as the appearances of an underlying relationship of exploitation. Now, very often the course of the exposition is explained as a movement from the abstract to the concrete, and Marx certainly also uses that type of terminology. I particularly emphasize it's also a movement from the essential to the surface appearance. This is the last point, which I've already sort of set up as I think this is in actual fact the biggest issue to understand with the 3 volumes, right? Is what produces wealth in society, what produces commodities as the capitalist form of wealth, labor produces versus capital produces. If you only think of it in terms of profit, it would seem that capitalists are the agents of generating new value. But because he's made all these connections, Marx has shown actually that's a surface appearance, and the reality underneath is that labor produces. Now, the wage form is another surface appearance, if you like. I mean, it's in circulation, it's exchange of money. Now, Ricardo's school, as I mentioned, broke down, but Ricardo did have, on the one hand, a theory of value, and the other hand, he knew that wages and profits were inversely related. So he, if you like, as Marx often says, was, if you like, the last point of classical political economy. And Marx did respect Ricardo's contribution, but what he also did is he was able to move beyond it. And I'm just putting in here, these are some of the further mediations, the further steps in the movement that Marx puts in. And there's the movement. I think that's all on this one. Okay, so what did Marx have to say about his own methodology? There are a lot of clues. A lot of it is actually putting everything together and sort of reworking it in a combined way. So in the introduction to in the preface to the very first edition of Capital, Marx recognizes, he gives the reader, as we all know, who've read it, recognizes that it has a difficult beginning. And the difficulty is in explaining this thing of the value form, which is the form that commodity exchange value takes, and the money form. And he uses this value form, money form type designation. Okay. The second issue, now, sorry, the one thing here to notice is, okay, so even though he recognizes it was difficult, you have to ask the question, so why did you start with that? And that's something to bear in mind as we go through. Why did Marx actually start where he did start, right? The other thing that Marx brings out in this introduction is he explains that his conscious application to analyze capitalist mode of production of the use of abstraction. So this is clearly fundamental in his method, the use of different types of abstraction. And what he means by that is focusing on one plane of analysis, one level of analysis, one perspective of analysis, and pushing the other aspects into the background. Again, there are sort of like physical analogies to this. You could think of this as a sort of like looking at a building from above or from the side or from the other side. I mean, these are planes of analysis of an object. Of course, it's a bit more complex because the object itself is more complex, right? And the third big point that Marx makes in this first introduction is the question of development of the capitalist mode of production. And he does say he's taken England as being the sort of the prime example of this to illustrate the general laws of capitalist mode of production. And certainly you would quite reasonably read this as thinking that all other countries will follow England's suit. What he actually clarifies later on is that he was just talking about comparisons within Western Europe. But of course, this is an extremely important point in terms of considering the capitalist mode of production, not only as sort of like other countries following the same route that England took, that capitalism took in England, right? But a completely different type of relation where actual fact, England's development of the capitalism development in England is predicated on a very different type of development of capitalism in the colonized or formerly colonized part of the world. And not only Marini, but that's exactly what many other writers sort of look at. Marini, I would highlight as doing that. Okay. In the content of Volume 1, Marx consistently positions himself as critiquing two strands of political economy. The first strand, which he calls vulgar economics, is exemplified by the work of Bailey. And Bailey basically says, you want to know about prices? Well, it is what it is. Exchange value, don't bother yourself. We should not be bothered with trying to find something objective which regulates value, but regulates price, which is not itself price. And this is the mainstream bourgeois economics of today, by the way. Right? The second position, which Marx also critiques, but if you like, develops much more consciously from, is, as I've already said, classical political economy. The figures of Adam and Ricardo figure prominently. who had a labor theory of value, but could not connect the labor theory of value with the form that value takes, which is the form of exchange value. In other words, they didn't really explain money. They didn't explain price, not just the magnitude of price, but price itself. How comes the products of labor have a price? Okay. And Marx also critiques Ricardo for not thinking effectively about the social relations behind the economic form. So Marx's methodology overcomes consciously this connection between the social and the economic, and between the external form and the inner connection. This is almost an aside for now, but if you wanted to, you could go back and work out where Marx is telling us he's going to be headed in the rest of the 3 volumes. Okay, there's quite a few sort of fragments scattered around the text of volume 1 on his use of dialectical method. These I'm giving some examples here. The big issue that Marx has is a question of further development. Another big issue is the question of movement. His method is not only about going from the initial appearance to the essence. He thinks that's necessary but not sufficient as a scientific study. He argues that you need also then to reconstitute the appearance from the essence, and he gives the analogy of religion, which you may or may not like to accept, but that is his analogy, right? And this is a very interesting one. He actually does give, as he does elsewhere, some recognition to Hegel. I'm actually going to argue that Marx's concept of contradiction is distinct and is a rupture from Hegel's, but Marx is giving a clear nod to Hegel in that quote there about the source of, if you like, a systematic view of dialectics. Now, going back to this further development, this is one of my main takeaways, right? Marx doesn't just see this as a sort of a fairly, what's the word? He sees this as preceding by a qualitative changes, right? He sees that this is the movement of quantity into quality, which is in a sense what money becoming capital. But even more important, right? Marx sees the question of dialectical inversion. And as we read towards the end of volume 1, this comes up several times in several different places. And I've given them some notes here, right? Dialectical inversion of the worker and the means of production. Dialectical inversion of labor and capital, dialectical inversion of intellectual labor and manual labor. And this is a constant theme in Marx. And I think he carries this through dialectical inversion into this question of the product of labor and the product of capital. Okay. Marx makes these comments to Engels, and Marx is, this is volume 1. He's commenting on volume 1, right? And he says, these are the 3 main points I make in volume 1, right? And the one that I want to draw attention to is that wages, the form of wages, conceals what they're really based on. And he's explained this, we've read this, we've studied this, right? So surplus labor disappears in the wage form because wages appear as though they stand as a reward for labor for the workers of all their labor, but actually it's only the equivalent of their necessary labor time, not their total labor time. So they disguise the contribution of the workers in terms of the surplus labor time. Okay, so these are the intellectual gains that Marx thinks of his own work, or the key ones in volume 1. And so once again, we have to think of what does he say about how he achieved it. The afterword to the second German edition is, in my view, probably if you're going to read one thing from Marx about his methodology, this is the one thing. Okay, this I've already mentioned, the distinction between research and exposition, right? He makes it very clear that while Hegel was the first to systematize the idea of dialectics, he didn't invent dialectics, by the way, he systematized it, right? Nonetheless, for Hegel, this was all within the realm of thought. Hegel absolutized thought. And what Marx is very clear is that no, dialectics in thought has to relate to the dialectical movement of reality. Okay, so the material world is the source of the dialectical movement. The material world moves in a dialectical manner. Okay. And he makes a series of other points. I am already conscious of the time, so I'm going to skip these, but I do think they are very, very important, right? I'll just highlight one, right? It's not only that Marx counterposed the materialist dialectic to an idealist one, which is how he saw Hegel's dialectic, right? He also said his method was revolutionary. This is really important, right? It's not a passive materialism, it's an active revolutionary imperialism. It's very essence critical and revolutionary. Okay. And I would say further, I don't think Marx ever explicitly said this, right? But what's implicit in this is that Marx's standpoint in the dialectic is very much a standpoint from the class position of the working class. There's, for reasons of time, I'm going to skip all this. This is just information for you, right? This is what I want to get onto. The sort of orthodox Marxist approach to dialectics as a method is for first half of the 20th century anyway, based on Engels' version of it. Now, Engels wasn't wrong on any of these things, and there's certainly a case for popularizing and trying to explain what the dialectical method is. And Engels tried to boil it down to these 3 points, which is the movement from quantity into quality, the interpenetration of opposites, which are united but also struggle against each other. And this is the idea of the contradiction. And then the one that people find probably a bit difficult to grasp is the idea of the negation of the negation. And this is really the idea of transcending through denying a current reality and moving on to another level of reality. And this is called sublation. Now, very influential. Engels thought dialectics apply to any field, including sort of natural sciences and so on. In terms of Engels' contribution on political economy, he tended to emphasize the historical over the logical. I mean, sometimes for good, sometimes it caused a slight problem, but I mean, that was his tendency, right? And there have been revolutionary leaders of the 20th century, particularly where revolutions are actually active, which is in the global south. So leaders such as Mao and Cabral consciously applied dialectics to revolutionary political class struggle. And that their main source of inspiration was dialectics as understood through Engels. So, it was a major contribution. The slight issue with Engels, right, is he doesn't enter enough, in my view, into the specifics of Marx's dialectical treatment of political economy, of the capitalist mode of production. And this is important because it's more than just an application of Hegel, it's a superseding of Hegel. Okay. And so in Engels' view, this emphasis on materialism versus idealism was accentuated, emphasized. But is it enough? Does it take us far enough, right? And this is the next school, which is, I don't know if hegemonic, but certainly well known in academic Marxist circles in the sort of last quarter of the 20th century to today, so the last 50 years or so. And they did spot a gap in the official Marxism of the first half of the 20th century, which is the emphasis on the content of value and a lack of attention on the form of value, the so-called value form, exchange value. So the value form approach is a lot of writers in this school, and it's very influential in academic Marxism to this day. I think it was a step forward, but it also has its characteristic weakness, which is it tends to be stuck in the first chapters of volume 1. And I think many of the writers try to load too much into that first part and don't see how Marx develops them further in the later parts, and in particular, how present or not capital is in the first part, rather than implicit and waiting further development. Okay. They also tend to accentuate not only form as a expression, but also the domination of form. And this tends to focus on the role of abstract labor in their accounts. Okay. But also they miss something. They don't go far enough, right? Marx writes about the simple commodity as the value form. We remember this in chapter 1, okay? But he takes it further. If you go through what Marx is arguing, the simple commodity becomes the capitalist commodity, and this is a capital form. And I'll try to explain that before we finish. Now, so this explains where the different schools fit into this sort of scenario of Marx's development, which I've sketched out. The third school, which I've, not only me, but I'm glad to say there's a slight recovery of this school, particularly a group of Marxists in Greece are definitely working on this. And it's based on a comment by Lenin about Marx's Capital. In order to understand Marx's Capital, you have to study Hegel's Science of Logic. Just when you thought it was already not complicated enough. Actually, I don't think you do have to study Hegel's logic, but I think it helps to understand how Marx understood Hegel's logic. Lenin certainly found it very useful in this change of his position in his analysis of imperialism. He was quite ready to go back into the fray, if you like, in having looked at Hegel's Science of Logic. And the key issue there is the shift in the revolutionary subject, that the capitalist system was not a fixed system, that it's a process of change. So the way of thinking about change was very important to Lenin at that time. Now, I don't know this, but I don't think that Lenin had a full view of Hegel. I mean, Hegel was a reactionary, let's be clear about this. I mean, and in several different ways, actually, I think Hegel was racist. But, you know, it's one has to acknowledge that Lenin's use of Hegel was actually a major contribution in the turn to support national liberation movements as a subject of history, as well as an object of history. So at least Lenin got something good out of it. Another key figure is Rubin, and the other two are Ilyenkov and Vazhulin. Okay, and what they did is they did look at value as an exchange value, and it's sort of like independently, or for like alongside slight precursor to the value form school that I just mentioned. They brought up similar set of concerns. Vazhulin in particular tries to read capital through the lens of Science of Logic. I mean, they took Lenin seriously, basically, and they tried to work out what he was getting at. Ilyenkov's contribution is really important. I think it's not the full story, but it's extremely helpful. What Ilyenkov focuses on is the dialectic of the abstract and the concrete. And what he pointed out is that abstraction has got two quite distinct meanings. And this might be obvious to you, but it also might help you, right? What he's saying is abstractions occur in reality. Like you think of use value and exchange value. Exchange value is an abstraction from the multitude of different physical, chemical properties, right? It's a social abstraction. Okay, that occurs in reality. And then there's another notion of abstraction, which is the reproduction of empirical reality in thought. And so Ilyenkov is really revisiting themes that Marx developed in his introduction to the Grundrisse, right, where he begins to lay out what he's going to be doing, right? And what that is it's a reconstruction in thought of the dialectic between the abstract and the concrete. So the aim is to reconstruct from various sort of simplified takes and different aspects of capitalism, which is the abstraction, right? It's a simplified particular aspect, is to recombine those to try to rebuild, if you like, the reality of the movement of capitalism as a totality. So Ilyenkov is very helpful, I think, in reminding us about this aspect of Marx's methodology. Okay, now Vazhulin gives a very extensive mapping from the logic to capital. I've just been looking at it again. I actually don't agree. I I don't think he does it. He finishes the job, and I'll very quickly talk about this. Right, this is a schematic of the science of logic. There are three sort of major doctrines in that: being, essence, and the concept. And for Hegel, this allowed him to develop categories of thought which can deal with connectivity and change. These are all categories of thought for Hegel. Okay. So the one that is most important in Marx is the doctrine of essence, but he also is very aware and reworks more the other two doctrines as well. I think Hegel's philosophy is actually a reflection of the more or less the arrival of the bourgeoisie, because what he ends up with is the absolute idea. Now, the absolute idea, and many critical commentaries have pointed this out, is actually a sublimated version of capital. So what moves everything, the great agency, the great mover and shaker in the world for Hegel is the absolute idea. But in a way, it's just another way of saying we are the boss, the new bourgeoisie. Now, for Hegel, contradiction emerges in the movement into essence. Okay, this is very important. It emerges within thought as a way thought becomes clarified, what is and what isn't. Okay. Now, for Marx, he actually uses similar constructions, as we'll see, but what he does is he has a very different positioning of the basic reality of these categories. And in particular, for Marx, contradiction is never resolved. Within this universe, if you like, which for him is the capitalist mode of production, within this totality of the capitalist mode of production, contradiction is not resolved, whereas for Hegel it is. It becomes a reconciliation in the idea, right? For Marx, it's never reconciled. It just builds and builds. It's an antagonistic contradiction. And the movement of this contradiction is what Marx also adopts the term sublation from Hegel, but the content of the term is different because it's not a movement towards reconciliation. It's a movement towards systemic contradiction. Okay, and this one is just trying to indicate where I think each volume or set part of each volume focuses. Now, you're familiar with this, and this is something which I hope sort of illustrates the overall argument, okay? Which is Marx organizes the content between circulation and production. And what you can see is he moves from initial appearance into essence. He develops the essence, brings it back into appearance with wages on the one hand, and he also brings it back to a totality of systemic contradiction in the general law of accumulation. Okay, so the contradiction never goes away with Marx. I mean, we've been reading the section of the general law, and we can read, he emphasizes, this is really tough for the working class. This is antagonistic exploitation conditions. Okay, so the contradiction does not get suspended. Rather, it develops, extends, reproduces on a larger scale. Okay. So several writers, as Julin in particular, and Marx himself talks about a spiral. His work is in the form of a spiral, basically. Now, this is the second one that I really want to explain. This is me explaining the spiral. Okay, so this is where we start. Now, look, what's on the surface is markets. If you take a standard economic view of the capitalist mode of production, the market is king, queen, prince, and princess, if you like. Everything is about how wonderful the market is. Okay, what we've got is commodity markets, capital markets, and labor markets. We also have markets in land and natural resources, but in a market, you're going to have commodities, you're going to have money. Okay, that's why Marx starts with commodities and money, because he needs to build from there the particularity of the labor market. So he moves, he explains, in the first instance, he's got a commodity which is the product of the laborers. and this is the commodity. And from this, he explains not only commodity, but money. These are co-explained, if you like. They're explained in relation to each other. Yeah. And also he explains that the commodity production is producing use values and exchange values. So there's a doubling up of what production is here. That's hence the red and the green. That's trying to explain that. This is the first cycle. Okay. This is commodities as the products of labor. That's part one. Then what he does is he brings in a second relation, a second social relation, which is labor is exploited by capital. So he's got a second set of relations here. And at its heart, in its essence, there is a contradiction, which is between necessary labor and surplus labor time. Now, this is an example of inversion. What wages are is not what they appear to be, is not what they really are. Okay. And there is also a movement here of the commodity is no longer simply the bearer of value, it's the bearer of surplus value. So the commodity goes through a further development in this second cycle. And again, he explains toward the end of volume 1 that the accumulation of surplus value is conversion into capital is an inversion as well. Okay. Now the next cycle, which is in volume 2, is he starts here. Okay. And he goes through this cycle again, but from the perspective of the circulation of capital. So the perspective of the abstraction moves away from the class relation of exploitation and moves towards the circulation of capital through these different forms. Okay, so he's looking at appearance in volume 2, and then in volume 3 he brings these together and he explains how it is that capital can appear as though it's self-expanding value, that profits are really just an index of capital against itself. And so the inversion gets more and more, it's become more and more of the perfect crime, where the origins of profit get more and more hidden. So we have a sort of inversions all over the place here. Okay. And it is in the commodity form. When the commodity appears as cost and profit, surplus labor has completely disappeared. It disappeared once in wages and it disappears again in the commodity form itself. Okay. But Marx again doesn't stop there. He doesn't stop with, if you like, an analysis of the perfect crime. He says, even though there's been this perfect crime, the movement of profit is an expression still of this basic contradiction. And because of that, it is necessarily going to be the case that the system will go into crisis. So there's a determinacy from Marx, crisis all over, okay? It starts with profit, but it extends all over. So Marx adopts a systematic dialectical logic, which all these different elements in it, but he turns it against not only Ricardo, which he uses it against Ricardo, if you like, he turns it against Hegel as well. Okay, it's a difference because the totality is one of fundamental antagonism. The other aspect to this is Hegel's logic is based on the idea of one subject, one self-moving substance subject, hence the sublimation of capital and the bourgeoisie. Well, Marx is not saying that. He's saying, well, actually, the essential relation is between two subjects. Okay, so capital dominates labor, but there are two subjects. And he never lets go of that. Even when he's talking about self-valorization of capital and so on, that always underpins it. Okay. So Lenin kind of got something's a bit wrong on this, actually. And it relates to the whole question of part 1, which we haven't got time now to go into because I want to move on to the end, right? Okay. But his basic approach, I think, was very productive. Okay. The commodity form changes as we go through capital. The story that we've got in volume 1 gets us to this point here. It's the bearer of surplus value. right? Volume 2 sees it as a capital form. Volume 3 sees it as a profit form, right? So the story of the dialectical inversion is not over. I just want to illustrate something else that a couple of things that Marx uses before we finish, right? He uses the categories of not universal, as is in Hegel, but general. So general in sense within the capitalist mode of production, and movement from general to particular. He fills out the concept of surplus value with the different particularities, which we've discussed quite a lot. We understand, right? Absolute and relative surplus value. But then he brings them together. And this is the synthesis is also sublation. Okay, the bringing together in a totality, right? There's two aspects there, actually. One is synthesis, one is movement to totality, right? And this repeats, this is actually the core, this type of movement. The volume 2 is the clearest, the simplest, if you like, formal structure, okay, but it's also there in volume 3. So Marx has a fundamentally different ontology to Hegel, right? But the reason he, tips his hat to Hegel and says that he's his student is there is a strong influence. Okay, I think. Now, why is that important? It's just not because necessarily we're interested in Hegel, and I'm not, right? It's to do with understanding the structure of Marx's Capital. That's why, right? I mentioned this before. This Marx's Capital moves between types of abstraction, and depending on the level and type of abstraction, he's focusing on forms, processes, and relations. Okay, so we can see how these move through the different volumes where his emphasis is, right? Marx's conclusion to volume 3 is quite open-ended, but there is a sense of conclusion, right? The main cycle of the 3 volumes is about industrial capital, and he does bring that implicitly. This is open to a lot of interpretation, right? I think it's just not finished in terms of the writing, but I think conceptually it's very clear that Marx brings this to a culmination with the crisis of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. This is the capitalist system necessarily going into crisis. Okay, then after that he looks at profit again, but not as industrial capital, but other forms of surplus value appearing as profit. And then very interestingly, he comes back to fetishism, but it's no longer commodity fetishism, it's capital fetishism, right? Right. Okay, so we're very near the end now, last couple of slides. This is what I think Marx has given us. He details the particulars of surplus value. He details prices of production, and he details capitalist profit. I think what the work of Marini does, so this is Marx still, right? What Marini does is he allows us to develop, and Lenin actually, the theories of imperialism, allow us to take these developments and another step further. So we can see how the further development fits with the content that Marx has already given us. This just is a diagrammatic way of saying how I position myself concerning the other main sort of not well-known writers on this topic of interpreting Marx. It isn't easy. It's certainly worth the effort, and we will, thanks to the CSSGJ, be going into volume 2 and volume 3 in the next years, and we can also discuss what we're going to do the rest of this year as well. Okay, and then there's bibliography. As usual, I slightly rushed the end bit, but I've just seen the time, so we better stop now. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Yes, excellent, Andy. Indeed, a tour de force, not just concluding, but actually also providing nice overviews of how Capital One, Volume 1 may actually fit with the other two volumes, yeah, and your own position vis-a-vis other people who have commented on this body of work. So we've got still a bit of time for questions, contributions, debate. Who would like to start us off, please? Any questions, colleagues, comrades?
Are we still recording? What did we? Okay.
That's a good question, actually. Do colleagues want? Do we keep the Q&A recorded, or would people prefer to switch it off? What's the feeling? No particular strong feelings?
Completely open.
You are open-minded, Tim. Yeah.
That was very rich, Andy. A really good overview. I don't have a clear. I'm trying to develop where we take it, but I want to go back and go through all your slides. That you present such rich. That your diagrams, I think, are very helpful. But they take a while to digest. And I really do emphasize, I found it very helpful, very useful, and your overview and your transparent critical engagement, I think, is very helpful, and just as something for other people to come to. But yeah, we've got work to do, haven't we?
Yeah, it's not over till it's over. All right.
What are the concrete plans, Andy, in relation to reading Capital Volume 2? Do you want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, okay. It's a shorter book. It's about 500 pages, and as we know, Volume 1 is about 900 pages. So I think that we could cover it in about. It depends on the pace of a reading group, okay, but I think 8 or 9 lectures cover it, and if they're more or less monthly, I'm pretty sure we could do it within a year. I mean, Andres and I were in a very nice group. I really enjoyed it 2 years ago now. I think we did Volume 2, or maybe 3 years. So I think there's also an issue of the introduction to it. I mean, Volume 2 has got much less empirical material, which kind of like in Volume 1, we've seen there are 3 places where he tells us an awful lot about what's going on with, working day, machinery, and also now under the general law. We don't get that in Volume 2, so it's a bit sparser. But actually, I do like it. Because it gives you a sense of movement. Marx is so good at writing about movement and dynamic, and that's really important in Volume 2. There's a domain of time. I think in preparation, people could also read, and maybe I'll send something out, I don't know immediately, but sometime in the autumn, some of that part of Volume 1 which has been appended, which is this immediate results, or whatever it's called, right? Not all of it, but some of it helps prepare for Volume 2. It's a good link into Volume 2. Yeah, so it's like a 4 or 5 year program.
Absolutely. Any other questions, concerns? Yes, Giovanni.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Andy, for this great presentation. I would like if you can speak a little bit more about Marx's point of view about a kind of, compared with the classical economy, no? Because sometimes the terminology is the same. So when he speaks about pure case versus complexity or model, because I think one of the biggest obstacles is that sometimes the reader try to apply the standard logic. So for example, the language of science or physics, because Marx is very involved in physics, no? So when he speaks about a pure case, we think is a non-real case, and it's only a kind of model of the complexity that is the real. But for Marx, sometimes this pure case is more important than the real, and there is this kind of inversion between pure case, simple case, complexity, simplicity, no? Like the fact that, for example, and also another topic that I find sometimes very, very hard and elusive is like you emphasize the difference between appearance and illusion or mistake, right? So we know that appearance doesn't mean that is a kind of fata morgana, no? So a bit to clarify this conception of pure case versus a complex case and appearance, if appearance is connected with this complex case or not necessary, right? Thank you.
Oh, those are big questions. I mean, okay, so in the introduction to the Grundrisse, Marx says, okay, so the initial political economy went from the complexity of reality to try to boil it down to a few abstract concepts, notions. I don't know, when he uses examples of value, exchange value, maybe, but population, I think, is one of them. Okay, and then he says in the second phase of political economy, the movement is from these simple, rather general, but rather empty ideas, okay, because they're so general, they're a bit empty, right, is to try to build from them an explanation of reality. And he says that that's the more scientific method, okay. Now, that's not actually the only thing that Marx does, right, because what he does is he does both, right, it moves in both directions. But the difficulty in following Marx is that he starts off with something which is already a result. And I'm sorry, this seems very paradoxical, right? But he starts off with a commodity, right? And he says that this is the element of the mass of wealth in bourgeois society. And therefore, we'll start with that. Now, there's two or three, I think either tricks is not the right word, but two or three slippages, which he does already, right? Because I think, and this is a big debate, I mean, you can read it either way, right? The commodity that he looks at from that point on is not the commodity as it appears in bourgeois society, right? It is a simplified version of the commodity, right? But what he wants to do, he needs to explain a product of labor which has a price tag put on it. That's what he's got to do, right? He's got to do that before he can explain that labor power adopts the commodity form. It's something to be bought and sold, right? So it's a necessary logical prior. So as we know, his explanation of the simple commodity is not so simple. He knows it's the most difficult part, right? But he's got to do it, right? Because he needs to explain that there's a particular historical type of society in which labor power is a commodity. And so he's then got to explain what is a commodity first and what money is first in order to come on to that. Okay, so always think of the content is what I'm trying to get at, right? The more I look at it, I mean, that is his advance on Hegel, right? Hegel's system was to fit any circumstance, you know. So what? You know what I mean, right? Marx's system is to explain capitalism, right? So his dialectical steps are all about content. The content is necessary to have this explanation, this movement. So the question of from simple to complex is a bit, you know, tricky, right? But it's not so tricky from one point of view, right? In that first part, commodities are still just the products of labor, right? There isn't exploitation there. Now you can say that that's what he presupposes will come, right? So this question of simplification is also a matter of what's explicit and what's implicit, okay? So what's implicit, because the book's called Capital, you know, not a surprise, we're going to get to capitalism, right? So that, we know we're going to get there, right? But he starts off without a labor capital relation, okay? And he starts off that commodities are the product of labor, right? Now, for me, that's also an ontological statement. He's putting a line down here saying, I'm with the working class, right? Whatever else comes, commodities are the product of labor. But something else does come. The commodity becomes something which is produced by labor, which is exploited by capital. And that's a further development, right? And in contrast to the rest of the literature, but I think there's lots of evidence in Marx to say this, right? I think the essential point about the commodity is this contradiction between capital and labor, and that over-determines, if you like, use value and exchange value. Use value and exchange value don't go away, but they're not so important. They're reworked as soon as you introduce capitalist exploitation of labor, right? Because the essence is not just labor, it's labor that's exploited by capital and produces surplus labor. That is the essential relation. So if you want to boil it down, that's the fundamental contradiction. Capital exploits labor, and it presents as though capital is itself the agent of creating new value, whereas and that's the inversion, and that inversion goes all the way through, I think, from that point on. I don't know if it's exactly answering your question or not. I'm just repeating what I said.
No, it's a great answer. Also because the question of appearance, it's also that sometimes seems that capital is really the agent. So the word appearance is sometimes means it is and sometimes means it's not, right?
Oh yeah, sorry, there is that. Yeah, and the Marxologist, if you like, literature. I mean, the question of translation does come in here, right? Because there's Sein and Erscheinung, right? Excuse my German. Exactly. Andres, luckily we have Andres here to clarify this, right? But I mean, I think one is closer to semblance, false appearance, and one is like,
Yes. Recently, Bellofiore has done a lot of insistence on this difference between manifestation and appearance, and so on. Yes.
Yeah. But the thing is, even the false appearance is an objective reality. That's the thing, right? And that's where you can think, well, Marx is actually just like Hegel in the end. Well, he's not, but he does recognize that there's a reality to this false appearance. Yeah. And in the end, I mean, just to explain it a little bit more, right? Labor is the source of value, the substance of value. But if you look at the way capitalist production works, labor time is reduced to being something which generates a cost. So they will control production in terms of cost of production. And insofar as labor time generates cost, that's how they'll see labor time as well. Okay, so the inversion is real. It's not only in exchange, it's in the control of production.
Thank you, Andy. Amanda, you're next.
Thanks. This might be really a silly question, given what you just said, actually, about the inversion. But is there any moment in the 3 volumes where that subsumed labor power appears as an ideal subject? You know what I mean? Where he punctures or turns things back on their head, I guess. Sorry, this is really not my language. But you know what I mean? Where he actually, is there a moment in the 3 volumes where he really, or maybe we've already gone past it, and
there are glimpses, and if we could go back through the lectures, I think, I'm not sure I picked them all up, but I think I picked some of them up. Okay, so when he talks about education, for example, toward the end of chapter 15, I mean, he does talk about education of an all-rounded individual, and there's quite a strong suggestion that that's what you would do in a more socialist society. There's an argument there, it might be a different type of capitalism as well, actually, just the way you wrote it. But he does talk about instead of the workers being subordinated to the means of production, the means of production be subordinated to the workers. I mean, I can't remember the exact place, but there are glimpses of a society where this inversion is restored. I think it's there, it's present, but they're glimpses. I think also, sorry, but I think it's also, again, in volume 3, he talks a bit more openly about association of producers. I think there are glimpses in volume 1. So the other way to look at this, by the way, is this critique of form, right? And this is the difference, again, the way classical political economy expresses the labor theory of value is that this is the commodity fetishism argument, and there's some truth to it, right? Which is that, the value is like a property of the object, right? What Marx is saying is, well, it's a social reality of the commodity, right? But that's an historically limited social reality. So as soon as you say it's historically limited, it means that, it can move on to something else. And I think also finally in volume 1, of course, there is the old thing after the general law, he writes about primitive accumulation, and the real culmination of volume 1 is actually in the section on primitive accumulation, because he says, the integument will be cast asunder, the expropriators will be expropriated, right? Now that's interesting, right? Because that could have been in the Communist Manifesto. That is a culmination of his argument in volume 1. But his justification for it is essentially historical materialism. I mean, what comes into being will end, will be overcome. It's got a historical start, it'll have a historical end. Okay. I think the problem is that in volume 3, there's a very strongly implicit, deeper culmination. You just didn't finish writing it, okay? And that is the crisis of profitability, right? Because that's more determinate. And that's where the question of the consciousness of the working class comes in. That's the purpose of the whole book in a way, right? Which is because under capitalism, we're always going to suffer. The question is, capitalism in crisis requires overthrowing the capital relation with labor itself, not an improvement of it, right? Because in the crisis, all improvements are exhausted. There is no improvement. On the contrary, things are going to get a lot worse for everybody. Okay. And, we're fast approaching such a situation. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Andy. Virginia, you are next.
Unmute and
Now we can hear you.
Yeah, thanks. Again, I have to say this isn't really my language, in the sense that as you were talking, I kept asking myself a couple of questions, but one of them was to do with what does this have to do with just being, in part, another way of talking about a worker being alienated from the means of production. And so kind of the other question has to do with what you just said about on volume 3, maybe you could elaborate on that, association of producers, meaning people who are not alienated from the means of production, but they own it themselves, this association. But are they workers or worker producers, or what are they? And then another question, not quite related to the previous question, but slaves and slavery prior to capitalism, to what extent would slaves be considered a pretty ancient commodity?
Yeah,
those are my questions. Thanks.
Yeah, no, very good. So Marx talks about alienation in part 1, and there he's talking about the alienation of the commodity from its producer. So the producer produces something, it's an object, goes on the market, it goes away from them, right? He reworks the concept of alienation, of course, as soon as you got the capital labor relation, okay? Because the alienation is of the labor time of the worker being appropriated by another class, right? So that deepens the idea. The object is no longer the thing, the commodity. The object is capital. Capital is taking the worker's effort. So it's a different type of alienation. But what the thing about that is there is this movement away from the worker, right? The control moves away from the worker. Capital dominates the worker, right? So there's this inversion of subject and object. The worker becomes an appendage of the machine. So you can definitely understand that subjectively, and all they're doing is attending machines, these self-acting mules and so on, right? So this is also alienation, but he's got this, so it's a subjective side to it, but he's also got an objective explanation, if you like, or a structural, let's say, explanation for it as well. So I think alienation runs through it, and I would, I've used the term dialectical inversion, but you could quite often put alienation in there as well, right? association of producers. This is an interesting point, and I said volume 3. So Marx never finished volume 3, as we know, right? And Engels did a lot of editorial work on it. And the current fashion in academic circles is to really critique Engels' editorial ship. I don't agree. I think Engels did a magnificent job. If you think of what he had to work with, which is basically Marx's handwritten notes, I think it's incredible that he turned that into a book, right? In that, Marx is actually quite optimistic about the joint stock company, okay? And there's a certain parallel here between his view of the state and his view of the capitalist enterprise, right? So early doors, they hoped that, the workers could, be elected and there'd be a relatively peaceful transition to a socialist type society, right? After the Paris Commune in particular for them, they saw that the bourgeoisie never going to give this up voluntarily. They'll be very violent to stop the workers. I mean, so this was one of their lived experiences, was of the Paris Commune, by the way, in terms of what an association grassroots organizing would look like. Okay, so for a while, the workers ran Paris. I think it was about a couple of months that the Commune lasted. Okay, so they had this idea of a political form emerging from the working class struggle itself, which they would champion and defend. But Marx actually famously said they didn't go far enough. I mean, they needed to repress the bourgeoisie, because if they didn't, the bourgeoisie is always going to find a way to fight back. Okay, so the dictatorship, the proletariat comes in. Okay, so that's on the political side. Now, on the economic side, I think Engels' additions are quite helpful and significant, because on the economic side, Marx is sort of living through a time where the joint stock company comes back in big time, right? And you're actually quite right. You mentioned the 1866 crisis, and they looked at that quite closely, right? And Marx saw that as a crisis of the credit system, but he saw the credit system as a way of socializing ownership. It's a bit like the public-private thing. It's not really socializing to everybody, but within the capitalist class, it was socializing ownership. Capital can move in and out of individual companies through the credit system. Okay. Now, Marx's initial view of this was that this could be a stepping stone towards socialism, because it's the socialization of capital. Now, I think that this is unduly optimistic, and Engels kind of more or less says so. He said, in reality, come on, right? This is not going to happen. It's a bit like the state. We've got to learn that these are not, okay, in one sense, socialization of production is the last stepping stone to socialism, but in another sense, not at all, because it's a hierarchical organization and power and control and so on, right? And so Engels kind of writes this in and adds this in to Marx, okay? And so Marx is talking about association of producers. He writes about it in relation to the land, producers on the land, okay? And it does go back to this idea of expropriation of the expropriators, right? Because right at the beginning, the producers of commodities are labor, right? The workers produce the commodities, right? Now, as soon as you got this class relation, who is producing the commodities? And this is what I keep coming back to. In a sense, capital produces the commodities, right? Even though they employ labor to actually do the work, right? It's an Apple iPhone. You know what I mean, right? They design, they control the means of production, so on and so forth, right? So it's not in the same sense, right? But it is in a certain sense that it's a dominating subject in the relation, right? So who are the producers, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Andy. Tim.
Slavery.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
In my view, very quickly, maybe, right? I actually do have a formulation which I say labor power is a commodity, right? Now, in chapter 4 or 5, wherever it is in volume 1, Marx says that labor power is a commodity owned by the laborer themselves, right? Without any dependencies. So I'm saying he narrows it down at that point, because that's wage labor of a type as well, right? Okay. So, but I mean, under capitalist slavery, labor power is also a commodity, but owned by somebody else rather than the laborer. Okay, so you kind of see how you can make, there's other peculiarities, because under slavery, the laborer is also capital. And so that's a particular thing of slavery, as well as the racial violence, which I should say, because we should never take it for granted. But the thing about enslavement also is it fits in. I mean, we talked about this before. It had a rejuvenation, if that's the right word, because it fitted into the main commodity chain for industrial capitalism. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Yeah.
Tim.
It was just an addition to this further development of alienation, and I think it's a point Andy's familiar with me making, but because Marx, a number of points refers to, the total social product and productivity of labor, and he includes in that all science and technology. It's like the powers of labor alienated, if you like, right up to the highest level of the social division of labor, and the concept of the association of labor, bringing that back under conscious control, would require a complete challenge to capital, and the whole structure of society. And in a sense, there's an echo of that in Marx's critique of the Paris Commune, in the sense of the failure to take control of capital in its financial form, to leave any aspect of that aggregation of the product of labor, the social wealth, the product of labor, out of workers' control. So it's really important to see. So many people have seen alienation at the level of direct industrial production and the direct exploitation. But I think we have to take alienation to that full total social capital. All the products of labor, even though at the highest levels it becomes conceptually quite diffuse. And that's often a mystification for a lot of people. They see science and technology as something antagonistic to the labor movement, for instance, and when it's all the product of labor.
Thank you. And over to you for final word, or if I can just ask, is there anybody else who would like to raise an issue? You're coming slowly to the end. No? Okay, so Andy, over to you for final word.
Yeah, in terms of my critical view of the main interpreters or companions or explainers of capital, I think that they're lost in circulation. Okay, and I think that the current fashion has been to move away from the fundamental relation of labor producing surplus value. Okay, so I have to be quite careful how I say this, right? I think that the move to understand circulation was necessary, right? But you have to bring it back also to the relation from production side as well. Okay, now this is extremely important. Only think of the world today and where is stuff produced and where does it circulate, right? I mean, there's factories in Venezuela where the women making swimwear could not afford to buy the swimwear they were making, right? Because they just couldn't afford to buy a bikini or swimsuit, whatever it was. Okay, and this is just a characteristic of the world today. And I do think this concentration on exchange value is a sort of, can easily become, let's put it like that, highly Eurocentric, right? And the distance, the social distance away from the actual production activities and labor processes and so on. Okay, I don't think that's inevitable, but I think that is the current tendency, right? And I do, just to respond to Tim, I think we have to be very careful about the role of intellectual labor in this context, right? Because, I mean, companies like Apple, for example, I mean, they keep the design control and the marketing and all that stuff closely in house, right? Now, these are creative occupations and so on, right? But the way the division of labor is structured is that, they're kind of like the loyal ones or the better paid ones and so on. Now, of course, they are part of a collective labour force, okay, but there's also these distinctions in the labour force, and the division between intellectual and manual labour is a major one. So I think we should be aware of the sort of the impact of divisions in the working class from imperialism. I mean, I do accept your point overall that the social collective of labour should include these labour activities, but we can't see it in a, what's the word, in a, without being conscious of the effect of imperialism as well, is what I would say.
Thank you very much, Andy. This brings us to the end of our Capital Volume 1 lecture series. Thank you very much to Andy, of course, first and foremost. Thank you very much for you who have been regularly participating. Capital Volume 2, the next lecture series will be coming. Yeah, so watch this space. We will be in touch. We've got all your email addresses and let you know when it will be starting concretely. Now, before we go, one final announcement. The last seminar by CSSGJ, the Center for the Study of Social and Global Justice, will take place on the 10th of July. It will be at our usual time, 6 p.m. And it will be our own Oliver Dodd who is going to present on the origins of the Colombian Civil War. So please keep that in mind. We look forward to seeing you all then. And until then, have a good evening. Thank you, everyone. And
Thank you.
congrats to Andy. Thank you.
Andy.
Thanks.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.